So hello, everyone. My name is Becca Oliver. I'm the Executive Director here at the Writers League of Texas, and I want to welcome you to our program this evening. It's a part of a larger series that we started in the last couple of years called WLT on the Craft of Writing. And in the last few months, we've talked about writing novellas. We've talked about writing short fiction. We love to invite authors that we admire to come hang out with us for a little while and talk about a very specific aspect of craft. And so tonight, we're so thrilled to be focusing on poetry. So I want to first thank all of you for being here and for spending your Thursday night with us. I want to encourage you to consider dropping some questions in the Q&A box throughout. We'll definitely have some time for questions at the end. But the idea behind these talks is we bring these authors together and we talk about the craft process. We talk about the publication process. We talk about pretty much anything under the sun having to do with that particular piece of craft. So let's get to it, okay? I'm gonna read some bios and then I'm gonna make this screen disappear so that we're all here together. And we got rid of the big screen, but just one more second. Usha Akella has authored 9 books that include poetry, 1 chapbook, and 2 musical dramas. Her latest poetry volume is published by the noted feminist press Spinifex Australia. She earned a Master of Studies in Creative Writing from the University of Cambridge, UK. She is the founder of Matwala, the first South Asian Diaspora Poets Festival in the USA. And I really hope that you'll tell us a little bit more about that at some point tonight. And www.thepov.com, a website of curated interviews. She was selected as a creative ambassador for the city of Austin in 2019 and 2015. She is widely anthologized and has been invited to numerous international poetry festivals all over the world. Thank you so much for being here, Usha.
I'm so delighted to be here, Becca. Absolutely.
And here we have second, Kirk Wilson. Kirk Wilson's fiction, nonfiction, and poetry is widely published in books, journals, and anthologies. His awards include prizes in all 3 genres, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and a Pushcart Prize nomination. Kirk's past lives include adventures in film, journalism, and advertising, and he lives in Austin, Texas with his wife, Donna M. Johnson, author of the memoir, Holy Ghost Girl. And he is a big supporter and someone who's been around and hanging out with us at the Writers League of Texas for some time. So thank you so much, Kirk, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Becca. It's a pleasure to be here.
And so here we go. So we're going to jump into this. The first thing I want to say, full disclosure, I am a big reader of poetry. I'm a collector of poetry collections. I love poetry. I am not a poet. And I'm thinking that there are probably some folks here joining us tonight who would say the same, right? But that we also have folks here who are poets. And I imagine we have people here who are writers, but maybe writers in different forms, not in poetry, who, while they don't write poetry, are really open to learning from the 2 of you about your process with an eye towards picking up an idea or 2 that might help with their own craft process. So that's a big group of people, but I think we're going to have a conversation tonight, which I am so excited about, that is going to inform all of us. And I will say, I say that partly at the start to have you forgive me for my ignorance when it comes to the craft and some of the real, details of poetry. So please excuse my questions if I show a little bit of that ignorance, but also to say that I know that I'm going to be learning a lot tonight too. And I really appreciate both of you being here. So to start, before we get into what poetry means to each of you as a writer of poetry, I'm just wondering if you could tell us, what does poetry mean to you in the larger sense? What does poetry mean to you as a person, as a human on this earth? Usha, I'm going to start with you.
Oh God! All right, that's a really. I'm going to get, I think, very literal in my answer, Becca. When I was very young, I was a chronic asthmatic. And I think writing kind of took the place of breathing for me, quite literally, because I spent about 8 years, many months by a window, looking at life outside this window. And it always seemed that life was happening to others. So I began to live in my head, I think, fairly early. And the written word, apart from, I think, genetics, found me pretty early. I come from a family of Telugu writers. I come from South India, and they're writers on my father's side. My mother tongue is Telugu. I come from South India. And so while I think my relatives pursued their literary lives with their mother tongue, I was a bit of, I won't say a rebel because it wasn't self-conscious. It just so happened that English was the first language that I learned. I breathe in English, I think in English, and I dream in English. And I think for me, it was very, very organic. I just learned to start processing myself and the world with the written world, because I couldn't actively participate in it too much physically. So when that happens to a very young child, you start to live in your imagination and your dreams. Of course, for many years, I wrote many bad poems and many bad stories, which were really, I probably had really no value or talent. But there was this passion very, very early on, and it just propelled me forward. And I really do think writing saved me. Absolutely. I think it did save me through those years and many years past that. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's really
it's a perfect
began.
answer. Thank you.
Okay.
Kirk, how about you? What does poetry mean to you?
Well, I love poetry, and I pretty much always have since I was a kid. Like Usha, I grew up in a household or a family that has a lot of writers and a lot of educators. It was the kind of house where if you didn't know a word and confessed you didn't know a word, you were dispatched to get the dictionary and look it up. And you looked it up, and by God, you remembered it, and you used it. You used it correctly. Until my mother died, I was still getting these emails from her, or not emails, she didn't use email, but letters from her, correcting what I had most recently said to her. So that happens. But it was a place where a lot of poetry was lying around, and poetry was a magic place for me. It was something that was, out of this world. I was a kind of very introverted kid. I spent a lot of time alone, and poetry was the sort of thing that helped me daydream. And it was very, very important, still is.
And so for both of you, I'm just wondering, was there a particular poet that you would say was, whether it was, as a young child, this poet really spoke to you and turned on this love of poetry, or even someone you found later as you started to explore your own creative expression through poetry? Kirk, you're nodding your head, so I'm thinking you have someone in mind.
Well, for me, when I reached teenage years, the momentum really started when I discovered Dylan Thomas. I loved Dylan Thomas. And I would go around, very obnoxiously and pretentiously quoting Dylan Thomas or sometimes Shakespeare to these other completely bored teenagers who had no connection with any of that. So I'm sure I alienated everyone, and I apologize to them if they're about it. Yeah, it was Dylan Thomas for me at first, and then a whole run of things. I had a wonderful teacher in high school for 2 years who taught us very intensively one Shakespeare play 1 year and another Shakespeare play in another year. And we went through it line by line. And that was a wonderful experience.
Love it. Usha, what about you? I read somewhere that you started reading Keats, and that was really like one of the formative first poets that you latched onto. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that happened in elementary school. I think I was in 5th grade or 4th grade, and that was really the first hook of poetry. I heard a poem by Keats about this boy running away to Scotland, and I remember that moment so clearly. I think that's when poetry just kidnapped me completely. But in terms of, the slow process of discovering poets and reading poets, we read a lot of the UK canon in India while growing up, and the American canon. And I remember we didn't have creative writing options. We didn't have creative writing electives or masters or undergrads or anything. So the next best thing you did was literature. You could pursue literature. And during my undergrad, I remember discovering T.S. Eliot and Khalil Gibran. And I think T.S. Eliot got me for the sheer music in his poems. You know, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is kind of indelible. Just it was the most magical thing that I walked into. And Khalil Gibran, just the heart of poetry. He is a spiritual poet, and that opened up another dimension. And then I discovered the romantics more seriously during my graduate studies, and yeah, slowly just started reading more poets, discovering different ways to process the world, and that's the way it began for me.
Well, and there was another quote that I found where you said, I realized that poetry was a powerful tool to use to express issues that bothered me deeply. And, I think both of you have used poetry in that way to express those feelings. And I saw somewhere today that today, on this date in 1955, was the first public reading of Howl by Allen Ginsberg. So the first time Allen Ginsberg read Howl in public. And it just made me think about that piece of poetry, that there's also an activism, for lack of a better word, in poetry, the ability to speak to big issues and big things. So I would love to hear you, before we get into the reading, because I'm going to invite you both to read a poem also, but, and sticking with you, Usha, and then we'll go to you, Kirk, I'd love to hear that piece of it from you. Like, what does poetry mean to you when it comes to being able to say these big things, for lack of a better way of saying it?
I think it became really inevitable on so many dimensions. You know, as a woman, as an immigrant poet, I think there was just no way I could escape activism. There was no way I could escape being political. There was no way I could escape being feminist. And early on, I felt that my poems were kind of falling around two pillars. And though I don't like to make those kind of extreme demarcations, there was the spiritual pillar, and then there was the activism, the feminism part of it. And at one point, I kind of felt I was fractured. I was either writing poems around this pillar or that pillar. But I think over time, I realized, in some sense, every poem is a love poem, every poem is a political poem, every poem is a spiritual poem, and those demarcations are really artificial. And I had to be true to myself as an immigrant woman poet, as a woman poet, as a human being. They really just start to intersect. So I think I'm very comfortable in my skin now. I don't really label. I think the most sincere, wholehearted feminist poem is a spiritual poem. And a spiritual poem emanates from a woman's sensibility as well. You can't take gender out of it, and you can't take the spirit out of gender. So I think I'm in a very comfortable place now. And there's just so much happening in the world, in the United States, that you have to resist, and you have to say no, which kind of coincidentally was the title of my first poem that made any sense for me. It was kind of a gateway when I began to understand how to write poems. And it was kind of a paradoxical title, no, because it was actually resounding yes. It kind of affirmed me on so many levels. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Kirk, how about you? Because I know especially your new collection is really talking about some really timely and important issues. So where does this activism sort of come out, or how do you see poetry as being a way to hopefully impact and maybe make change in the world?
I think, of course, there's an enormously long tradition there that you can tap into. The whole first section of the collection came out of the pandemic and out of all the social unrest, long overdue, the George Floyd killing and all of that. People reading it might find it a little bit more convoluted than political, but it came out of that time. It out of that atmosphere, and just one poet's reaction to all the things that were going on and are still going on. So I think that's there. Historically, I started publishing my first poems in the 60s. And that was a very crazy time. I once sat across the table from Allen Ginsberg in a coffee shop. And I remember, those times so well, and all the unrest that was going on. And when it all started, again, during that pandemic time, it was so familiar, so painfully, strangely familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. And what a way, what a form. And both of you so beautifully, especially in your most recent collections, I think just give voice to a lot. So let's get to it, because I would love to take a minute. For many of the folks here who are joining us, at least on the Zoom, we shared 2 poems with you when we shared the link for tonight, because we wanted you to have the opportunity to read along as well. But both Kirk and Usha have been kind enough to say that they would read a poem, and then we are going to continue talking, and we're going to get into craft, and we're going to get into the publishing side of things, and we're going to answer questions. So Kirk, I'm going to invite you to read first, and Kirk will be reading Mist from his new collection Songbox, which published in July. Is that right? July of this year.
Yeah, early August, but yeah, released in June.
All right, the floor is yours, Kirk.
Oh, thank you. I like the floor. This poem is called Mist. It's actually not in the collection. This is a newer poem.
Oh, it's not in the collection. I'm so sorry.
It's not. Didn't quite make it, but it could have. Mist. We are there together, a still pick with ocean waves. If we have spirits, they have left home to lie in the sun, and soon we'll hurry to get back into our bodies. There would be the sound of water breaking into water. There would be clouds working to collect light, dispense it elsewhere. This happens again and again. The great physician Thomas Brown avers that when you cut a body open shortly after death, a white mist rises from within. The same mist in the living body, Brown says, is what clouds the brain in dreams. A woman I knew said she saw the mist arise from her father's body, connected by a slender thread made of mist likewise that rapidly dispersed. I watched my father die and did not see the mist. It could be a clouding of the mind that kept me from it. Does it matter if this happens again and again? Of late, I hear from Earth's magnetic poles. They grow dissatisfied and dream of changing places. This happens again and again, the last time 780,000 years ago. Does it matter if my compass swings and I am sent in the opposite direction from the way I want it? If there are gods, and if they make mistakes, does it matter that they rescue me with yellow flowers the many times when I am lost? Does it if I can't patch up my argument with time, or if stones have tenderness as well as faces, and like all that will be no less beautiful regardless, are patient enough to outwait us and everything we know?
Thank you so much, Kirk. Thank you. It's really beautiful. I'm going to let the love come to you from the chat box. All right, we're going to sit with that for a second. And then I'm going to ask Usha to read, and then we're going to get into it. We're going to talk some more about craft. Show your love in the chat box, everyone. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to read a poem called Unsought Pickings. It's from my new book, I Will Not Bear You Sons. And it's dedicated to the African-American slave women subjected to forced breeding. The years between us a bald gossipum, clawed realities spinning yarns, chilling truth, not yarn. Mandeville knew this was a beast sprouting plant, our kutan, your cotton, their currency of carnage. I am told her pain is not yours to articulate, share or voice. Still I seek her in the blurred spirals of the feminine self, my hand seeking her palm as a mirror. Perhaps she imagines snowflakes to pick, snowflakes the white gold falling from the sky in the north. Instead, her fingers stabbed cotton like wasps. The destiny of her people hewed her body to a sickle seeking earth's arms more than sky. Did she think I'll be picking cotton till the sun is a hole in the lament-soaked sky of waning blues? Perhaps. Did she seek answers in the liminal spaces of unsought pickings blooming like soft cotton? Better the cotton picking than the wedding between the cows and the bulls, than the decree from dank walls, than the brooding air of muffled suffering, than the damp, wet cave of smothered pain, than fingers and pubescence prying her open like a can, than the unwilling rabbit of her private to his. Better numbing labor than the pinioning of air pressing as a bale of hay, the straw filling her mouth, throat, lungs, her eyes sweeping the air like bats. Outside the sullen crushed sympathy, like lifeless cotton with hardened seeds, ears dialed to deafness for survival. Better her hands furrowed and perforated, better her palms fissured with ancestral pain. Did the moments of anger pile on stone by stone to sift between unsought pickings, be a breeding woman than be fettered to a whipping post? This better than a back striped like a field, red petals of wells blooming to the sun, a waste of dandelions around her, drooping in shame, staining her memory's notebook of incoherent rage, a rage alive, breathing like cotton.
Thank you so much. Wow. So, I'm so excited to just talk to you both. And these were beautiful poems, and we appreciate you sharing them ahead of time. And I know that the folks who are here, I'm sure, are happy that they were able to read them and sort of sit with them ahead of talking tonight. So for both of you, such a tough question, I know, but we're going to talk about craft, and we're going to talk about craft in relation to these two poems, because I think it can be nice to have a context or have a reference, but we're also going to talk outside and about some of your other work for sure. But for both of you, and Kirk, we'll go back to Mist to ask, where did this poem come from? What was the inspiration? So let's start at the starting place.
Well, a lot of the inspiration that I work from comes from a line or a phrase that just comes to me from the air. Or sometimes it comes in a dream. That can happen too. Or sometimes it comes from reading, and I get all inspired by reading the work of another poet, which I think is a wonderful thing about poetry and a long tradition in poetry, where a poet can light her or his candle from another poet's flame and take something away from that. And I get excited, and I write down some lines, and fortunately, those lines don't have anything to do with the poem that inspired them, because you don't want to go around, plagiarizing people. That's not a good thing. No. But a lot of things do start from the wonderful energy of a line or a poem that I read. In this case, this poem started with the first line. The first line came to me out of the proverbial blue. We are there together, a still pick with ocean waves. And, that's a photograph we've all been in, right? We've all been at the beach in that photograph. I was there as a child with my parents. I was there in romantic involvements. I was there years later with my own children. So it's a picture that we all know. And I wanted to leave the we undefined so that anybody could put in their own picture. The other thing that I liked about that line, and I didn't think about that line before it came to me at all, but the other thing that I liked about the line once it had come was the idea of a still pick on the ocean waves, this turbulent, powerful earth thing, ocean waves that are stopped still in a photograph seemed to me powerful too. And then the rest of the poem kind of worked itself out from there, as my poems frequently do. And I work on poems for a very long time, and I set them aside and come back and tinker with them some more, and change words here and play with the order of the words, the syntax, play with the line breaks, put in new verses and throw them away. It goes on forever if I'm lucky. And there's one poem in the collection that I wrote when I was 19, and I've been messing with it ever since. And that goes on, and usually what happens is at the end of the first day, when I have some lines down that I'm happy with, I just put it away, and the next day I get it out and mess with it some more, the next day again and again. Then if I'm smart, I leave it alone, just let it sit weeks or sometimes months, and then mess with it some more. But it's a process that never stops, and should never stop. And that's, again, one of the things that I love about poetry is working on poetry, because a poem, a novelist told me once that he thought that poets are the Formula One drivers of the language. And I kind of get that, because poets aren't just going around the same circle 500 times like a NASCAR driver. Poets are zipping in and out of all these fields of meaning and smashing down the brakes of 200 miles an hour to go around a hairpin turn and executing all these things. And they have to, because every word, every break, every piece of language, has to be right.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to get a little more into, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And we're going to get a little more into process for sure as we keep talking. Usha, how about you? This poem, this beautiful poem, this hard, really just difficult poem too. Where did it come from?
So I was in the middle of completing this book, and it was already thematically in place. It was feminist, and the book was kind of I'd already concluded it was the overall format I'd already formed in my mind. The second part of the book was dedicated to women from around the world, and there was a reason for that. We can talk about that later. And then, BLM and everything erupted last year. And I knew that the book could not be complete without me paying homage to African American women, to BLM. And so I thought a lot about, what particular issue I wanted to write about. And I wanted to write about a woman's issue. And then so it so happened I read a paper about forced breeding during the years of slavery. And it was such a heart-wrenching piece. And then like Kirk, there was one line that jumped out of me, and it was a quotation from a slave woman. And she said, the forced breeding that was forced upon so many was like a wedding between cows and bulls. And it just broke my heart. That line was so poignant and so heartbreaking. That I think became really the reason. It gave me the impetus to write the poem. And then the question was, what was the doorway? How do I enter this very, very hard subject? And actually, the first version of it was a failure. And I'm going to share that